U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening Canada with fresh 50% tariffs on a wide range of goods, including CUSMA-compliant goods. Rafi Boudjikanian is following this developing story for us from Ottawa. What are the key points, Rafi, from this announcement?
Yeah, an announcement that just sort of appears to have come out of the blue, Ian. Trump administration officials held a phone call briefing with journalists moments before the publication of 3 proclamations by the U.S. president imposing a 50% tariff on goods that are covered, as you pointed out, by the existing U.S.-Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. CUSMA, goods that include hockey sticks, cement, dairy, Canadian wine, and other liquor. And officials said that this is retaliation to Canadian retaliation. So let's, if we rewind the tape a little bit, of course, there are a number of tariffs imposed already on Canadian goods or sectors of the economy like auto and aluminum. And in response to that, most Canadian provinces have taken the action, for example, of banning American booze off of their store shelves. We also know that the Trump administration has been unhappy with supply management protections for the dairy sector, for instance, even though that was something that was agreed upon the last time a free trade agreement was negotiated between the 3 countries. So this is a retaliation to the retaliation, according to Trump administration officials. It's been done under Section 338 of the U.S. Tariff Act, which essentially allows the administration to push back against what it perceives to be discriminatory action by a foreign country on U.S. goods. And these tariffs would come into force in 30 days.
Yeah, we're going to explore throughout the 2 hours of this program why this may have happened. Will it actually take place? Whether the reasons the White House are stating are, in fact, do they appear to be legitimate reasons? There's so much to talk about here. And as you point out, underscoring the fact that this came as a surprise to everybody. What are we hearing from key Canadian stakeholders, Rafi?
Well, this news is still just pouring in, and people are still trying to make sense of a lot of what's going on. But we did hear from Flavio Volpe, who is, of course, the head of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association and has been involved in a lot of negotiations with the administration over the last year and change. Let's have a listen to him.
They have to make a case that we are excluding or being discriminatory against them, and then you can put up the 50% tariffs. In all those cases that they've highlighted now of Canadian discrimination, those were Canadian responses to American discrimination that was unsolicited, right, that came out of nowhere. And part of the reaction to this is the Canadians saying, what did we do wrong? Canadian government saying, what did we do wrong? Well, this just really comes back to a year delay of, hey, we didn't like that you stood up to us. I think we did the right thing by retaliating. This is what gets them to respond. This is how that government works.
And I just want to focus sort of on the last part of what Volpe was talking about, because there's a bit of a similar theme in the statement we got from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce president, Candice Lang, who seems to be one of those folks who is not surprised by what's happened. We'll put that statement up as I read it to you. She said, "We knew this would get bumpier before landing. We shared our concerns with the Canadian government about the rising threat Section 338 tariffs posed, given something like this could be coming. While this is a regrettable escalation by the U.S. administration, we now have 30 days before this comes into effect. Both sides need to use this window to make meaningful progress in advancing formal talks. There are important discussions to get to that will strengthen, not threaten, our shared prosperity." Now, one of the most vocal critics of the Trump administration throughout the last year and change, of course, has been Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and he well, does not really seem interested in talking too much if the talking is about getting rid of the booze ban, for instance. He says, I'll never stop fighting to protect Ontario. If these tariffs proceed, Canada should respond tariff to tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar. Incidentally, all of Canada's premiers are right now gathered on Prince Edward Island for days of meetings, and I'm sure that this will be quite high on the agenda now, Ian.
No kidding, Rafi. It might be the only thing on the agenda for the first few hours of that meeting. Rafi Boudjikanian in Ottawa. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, so little time since this was announced. So many questions, questions that really deeply affect the Canadian economy. Could this be the beginning of an even deeper level of potential damage to the Canadian economy? So, Katie Nicholson is in Washington. Senior parliamentary reporter J.P. Tasker joins us from Ottawa. And to both of you, I may ask you some questions that you don't know the answer to, and just let me know. But we're all scrambling to try to figure all of this out. And Katie, let me start with you. This announcement comes less than 24 hours after the Canada, U.S., Mexico camaraderie, or what appeared to be camaraderie, at the World Cup. Any idea why this timing, why this announcement is being made now?
I mean, you're absolutely right, Ian. You just think about all those images yesterday. You had the three leaders on the stage together presenting the World Cup and all of the awards and medals. Everybody was all smiles. And then this afternoon, one of those people delivered this trade bombshell. So it is being framed by the Trump administration as a defensive measure. They point to the fact that only Canada and China retaliated against the first slew of tariffs back in January of last year. But on your question on timing, this announcement, it drops on the eve of the U.S. and Mexico's bilateral trade talks resuming. That's tomorrow in Mexico. And that's creating this sharp contrast, right, to any kind of public or official bilateral CUSMA negotiations between the U.S. and Canada. The needle simply doesn't appear to be moving forward at any kind of the same similar capacity, even though, yes, we are told there are calls and officials are in frequent contact. So this announcement just now of these sweeping tariffs without the usual carve-outs for CUSMA, it's a show of force, perhaps, from the U.S., a little bit of a Trumpian art of the deal, maximal pressure tactics, specifically here on things that we have seen and we know have irked American negotiators, things like the supply management for dairy and how some provinces yanked American alcohol off shelves. And it's telegraphing, Ian, and this is just my own sort of note on the potential optics here. It's kind of like it's creating this good cop, bad cop message, or a split screen. Look how well things are going with Mexico, whereas Canada in comparison could be made to look like it's standing still with some sectors sort of getting newly kicked in the teeth. But again, it just remains to be seen just how much of a blow this might be for Canada if these kick in 30 days. No guarantee that that's actually going to happen.
Yeah, and you mentioned art of the deal, right? One of the things that Canada, that the Prime Minister needs to figure out is this a serious proposition? Is this something that Trump actually does want to impose in 30 days? Is it just a audacious attempt to scare Canada, to intimidate Canada, and see what those guys do when we announce this? How do you even judge that? But let's take it for now, at least this evening, at face value, JP. These tariffs would hit products that have been entering the United States tariff-free under CUSMA. How significant is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's potentially hugely disruptive to a certain number of sectors. I mean, I was looking through the list. I was just on air, obviously, hosting Power and Politics. I didn't have a chance to go line by line, but there's 18, 20 pages in 3 different memorandums. And so there are potentially thousands of products that are caught up in this new tariff regime, up to 50% tariffs if they go ahead after the 30 days. And so certain sectors are going to be punished more than they already have been to this point. And it's interesting that they're kind of picking on sectors that are already hanging on by a thread. Lots of actions as it relates to the auto sector in particular. We know that has been hammered, pummeled by Trump's tariffs to this point, that so much business investment investment has sat on the sidelines in that sector because folks who run that industry aren't sure if there's really going to be much of an industry left when all these tariffs are in place for as long as they have been, if they continue to be for some time. So already industry are raising alarm bells about how this just makes a situation worse than it already was, how it just adds more uncertainty to a sector that really can't stomach any more uncertainty, especially as it relates to autos. The list is kind of a strange one in terms of the products that are covered by these new tariffs, but some of the experts that we've been speaking to this point say it's very carefully chosen what items are added to this list because the administration in the U.S. knows where there could be some pain points. You know, they know where some sectors are hanging on barely because of the tariff action. They know that just adding another 25% levy or more, 50% potentially, would be hugely damaging to some of these companies that are barely hanging on. And so it's all a deliberate effort to undermine the Canadian economy, to ramp up the pressure on the Prime Minister in particular, to get to a table and kind of hash out CUSMA and get to some sort of resolution. That's what the experts are telling us, it's trying to squeeze more out of Canada before they can cut a deal.
Yeah, you know, the one thing that caught my eye, JP, was they mentioned hockey sticks. I don't think that's a huge export industry in Canada. I mean, it almost feels to me like some people in a back room in the United States thought, oh yeah, let's put in hockey sticks. You know, that's really going to bug the Canadians. How did it strike you?
Yeah, and there's like ice skates on the list, kind of things that speak to Canadiana, if you will, right? Yeah. I mean, these are kind of like the image of banning or tariffing heavily so that they can't be exported, kind of picking at Canadian symbolism there. But yeah, to your point, I mean, we don't necessarily know. I mean, while industry and business is worried about the prospect of more tariffs, we don't necessarily know if this will force some industries to fold or if there will be layoffs to come, because it's not clear how many of these items we actually export in some instances. Like we're looking at grapefruit essential oil, like we're not really a grapefruit producer, right? In this country, it's not necessarily clear if all of these are carefully thought out or if they just went down the list of different tariff items they could impose and said, hey, maybe that's something we should throw in the list here. But based on what I've been hearing over the last couple hours is that it's generally a pretty deliberate list, and they know what could be problematic for the sectors in this country, what could set them back. And so it's certainly an attempt to punish us in some way, but also perhaps most importantly, jolt the trade conversations, because as you just discussed, Mexico will be meeting with the Americans. They've already had a number of discussions to this point. They're further along with the Mexicans, if we're to believe some of the rhetoric that's coming from Jamieson Greer, the U.S. trade representative. Whereas with Canada, things are kind of stuck in the mud. Canada's not willing to put the alcohol back on the shelves. We're not dropping those retaliatory tariffs on autos. We have dialed back some things here and there, but it's not to the Americans' liking. And so some folks who are smarter than me on trade issues are saying this seems like an attempt to get Canada to the table to try and make some progress on CUSMA in particular, after having made some progress with Mexico to this point. And so it's kind of not a last salvo by any means, but it's them striking out to get the attention of the Prime Minister and the people around him to maybe hasten their efforts to try and get to some sort of deal.
Well, let's hope it is an attention-grabbing strategy as opposed to an actual set of 50% tariffs that would come into effect in a month's time. Katie, I don't want to test on live television your, knowing the minutiae of trade law in the United States, but if I may, let me ask you about the section the White House is invoking here, Section 338. What do we know about that provision of U.S. tariff law and the potential for legal challenges?
Right, so it's old and it's obscure. It's a provision from a 1930 Tariff Act, and it essentially allows the president to unilaterally impose these additional duties up to, there's a cap here of 50% on basically any foreign nation that's deemed to, I guess, be discriminating against the U.S. and any kind of matter of commerce. Now, that means Trump doesn't really need Congress to sign off on those, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be court challenges, right? What is a discriminatory practice? Can that be argued in court? And we have seen lots of rulings around his imposed tariffs that have basically resulted in court-ordered refunds or a walking back or a nullification. So could that happen here? Absolutely. You know, the courts have entertained all of these challenges that we've seen since so-called Liberation Day.
Your knowledge of tariff law is impressive. Katie Nicholson in Washington, JP Tasker hosting Power and Politics Tonight in Ottawa. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.